Welcome to the weekly Zoom session of the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome, CACOR. This is the 256th session. I am Nigel Weir, and I will be the host. Our speakers today are from the Center for the Advancement of Steady State Growth, CASSE. They are Dr. Brian Czech, the president, and Dr. Dave Shreve. CASSE is a leading think tank in the transition from unsustainable growth to a sustainable steady state economy. The topic today is the DOGE Antidote, Sustainable Budgets and Taxes, Steady State Style. I will mention before they start, if you have questions, please place them in the chat and as well differentiate them from comments. So, gentlemen, the floor is open to you. Brian will be speaking first, followed by Dave.
Thank you, Nigel, and thanks so much to CACOR for an opportunity to speak about what we view as the antidote to DOGE. And I suppose for posterity's sake, YouTube, that we should remind folks or inform them if they're 10 years down the road. DOGE is the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, not a congressionally authorized department of the U.S. government, but rather a creation of the Trump administration designed to severely cut federal spending, balance the budget, but in a way that doesn't necessarily comport with sustainability. So we're going to talk about how the antidote to DOGE, sustainable budgets and taxes, steady state style. And at CASSE, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, we wear that steady state goal on our logo. Like to remind people at any chance we get that the steady state is the sustainable alternative to unsustainable growth or unsustainable degrowth. And at this point in history, as we know, there's been a tremendous amount of overshoot of planetary boundaries on most of the crucial fronts. And so we actually probably need degrowth toward a steady state economy, certainly in the wealthiest countries. But either way, it leaves for the sustainable alternative long-term goal, that steady state economy. There's always the question about, okay, well, what's going to be the optimum level for a steady state economy? And so we realize that for some people who may prefer a lot more crowding and noise and I suppose excitement in their mind, that's a different notion of optimum scale than those folks, including myself, that prefer a lesser amount of economic activity over the planet at large for so many reasons that have been covered in many CACOR talks. So we feel that what we muddle toward in a democracy is the optimum that takes all these preferences into account. And we realize there are various metrics with different foci, but all taken together help us to find that optimum scale. But if you don't have public policy that is conducive to, that assists in achieving that steady state economy, well, good luck ever maintaining an optimum level or any sustainable level of economy. And so, your basic policy levels come from the federal level through tribal with sovereign nations in the US and Canada, and state or provincial governments all the way down to county or municipal governments. And at CASSE, we don't have unlimited means, and we've honed in on what we feel are two very effective policy levels: the federal level, where Dave Shreve focuses, and as you'll see in a little bit, And then, of course, as you may have seen already in CACOR, we have a great county-focused program led by Dave Shreve. Just a tad more about that. At the federal level, at any policy level, you have different types of instruments that can be used to pursue the policy goal. Federal level, all the way from the very Constitution itself down through statutory and executive law and case law, and then regulations or administrative law. At the county level, you may have a charter, you're definitely going to have ordinances and resolutions, and you should have a comprehensive plan that probably will not be binding in a policy sense, and yet it provides tremendous amount of direction in policy development. So I think the point here is you've got policy from big P to little p, both in terms of the levels of governance, but also within those levels of governance, you know, from the US code at the federal level all the way down to the Code of Federal Regulations. And no matter where you are in policy development, you have to have a architecture that's going to work. And so what we like to follow at CASSE is what they call in poli-sci the SATG model. And there'll be a lot more to it than just this, but I'll just show the very basics, the S and the A and the T and the G, where the S is simply the statement of the policy. And what we're going to focus on today is double S, you might say, because it's a statute. That's simply the legal proclamation establishing the policy. Maybe the most important part before you start developing the policy is your goal, what you're trying to accomplish. And that should be reflected perfectly well in the statement. And the policy itself is going to contain material that identifies the agent, the agency or agencies that are responsible for administering and enforcing the policy. And if you didn't have a problem to start with, then you wouldn't need this T, but by virtue of the fact that you have this goal, you are trying to make some improvement, correct some problem, you have a target. That's the populace whose behavior is going to be modified by the policy in some way or another. And then, you know, a lot of our audience is familiar with ecological, ecological economics in general, and this great textbook by Herman Daly and Josh Farley. And these this is not the comprehensive list of their policy development principles, but there's a few really key ones here. Like if you have a policy goal, you need a distinct policy instrument for that goal. So we're going to be talking about the Steady State Economy Act. If you're an ecological economist, steady state economist, you want to achieve sustainable scale. You want to achieve an equitable distribution of wealth. You want to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. Well, you can't do all those things with just one policy instrument. You're going to need several. Those may all be contained within an omnibus bill, or those may be attained in three very distinct bills. You need to leave a margin of error ecologically. You can't make the mistake like they did in forestry for decades, always pushing for maximum sustained yield, because you have what is called in the environmental sciences stochasticity, environmental stochasticity. You have the carrying capacity in any sort of biological population is going to change with all types of natural and social factors. And you got to start from the existing conditions, you know, be real about it. Don't say, oh, we're going to overnight establish an eco-socialism and shoot for a GDP that's half of what we have. And that said, there's the principle of subsidiarity. If you have a problem at a particular level, you want to try to solve the problem with that policy rather than at a much higher policy level. And once again, we have decided to hone in at CASSE on federal and county levels. And in particular, with our Steady State Economy Act at the federal, and then the one we call the Keep Our Counties Great campaign at the county level. So hereafter today, we're focused on our Steady State Economy Act. And oh yeah, one last thing about sort of the context, the backdrop for developing a steady state economy. We, for a long time, for 20 years, have had our top 15 policies. The very first one is to formally adopt the steady state economy as the overarching macroeconomic goal. Kind of like currently economic growth is the overarching macroeconomic goal. I'm just going to rattle off 5 of them. Second one is to maintain a network of conservation areas sufficient to ensure long-term ecosystem services. Third is to stabilize population, aiming for a long-term population size that is comfortable and yet does not undermine the ecosystem. Fourth is to take those existing fiscal and monetary and trade policies that are set for GDP growth and ratchet them back toward a steady state economy. And then, of course, we want to limit the range of inequality, both in income and in wealth at large. And so with our Steady State Economy Act, now we're trying to accomplish several of these goals. So we need several different instruments. We need several different approaches, but we really emphasize that we're not going to get anywhere with any of these unless we can succeed with our top policy goal of formally adopting the steady state economy as the overarching macroeconomic goal. And that's why we simply call it the Steady State Economy Act. And it's the #1 goal of the policy, because otherwise, yeah, once again, it's just going to be a polity that's hell bent on growth like the current one. All right, so now the Steady State Economy Act. We have a substantial amount of it developed now. We had the findings and declarations finalized in 2020. Actually, the thing kind of dates back to my book, Supply Shock, when we were still calling it the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. We decided that just wasn't quickly communicative enough, so we've changed the title to Steady State Economy. Since 2023, with a mix of folks, and most recently, especially Dave, we have been producing what we call feeder bills, like the Commission on Economic Sustainability Act, the Sustainable Missions Act, the Sustainable Budgets Act, etc. I think you can see a theme here. Most of these feeder bills that roll up into the Omnibus Steady State Economy Act, most of them are centered around the concept of sustainability. Because as we like to say at CASSE, sustainability is a steady state economy. Growth not sustainable, degrowth not sustainable. And by the way, our next one up, we produce these feeder bills once per month. And the next one up is the Sustainable Population and Immigration Act. I'm sure that's going to pique some interest, so keep an eye out for that in the Steady State Herald. But today, we want to focus on fiscal policy, in particular, our Sustainable Budgets Act and our Sustainable Taxes Act, given that DOGE challenge to the very notion of sustainability. Yeah, here's the emblem of the DOGE work, you know, a reckless slashing of budget. It's fiscal policy, growth obsession style, you might say. So we've got our steady state style of fiscal policy. It includes some cutting of budget much more carefully, and coupling that with a tax system that helps toward some of the other goals, like the equitable distribution of wealth. All right, here's why we need this so badly. First of all, the deficit and debt are becoming serious problems to the very solvency of the United States. I'm not as familiar with the Canadian situation. I do know it's a problem in many governments around the world and globally. There's a out of control global debt. And so, of course, the annual deficit occurs when you have more spending than you have tax revenue. And there was a record deficit in 2024 of $1.8 trillion. It's continuing to climb. It's projected to be 1.9 trillion this year. And the debt was similarly at a record height of 27.8 trillion. 2024, it's projected to rise to 29.6 trillion by the end of this year. We're to the point now where the interest on the debt exceeds $1 trillion per year. That's more, for example, than the annual, than the Department of Defense budget. So this is a part of, a lot of people view steady state economics for some reason as a liberal endeavor or a left-leaning endeavor. We don't view it that way at CASSE. We don't view it as right or left, frankly. But there is certainly an element of fiscal conservatism involved in terms of maintaining a sustainable budget, a sustainable fiscal scenario, whereby the outlays do not exceed the receipts in any long-term sense, long-term or substantial sense. And in particular, this federal budget has to be part of the broader expenditure of the nation, and recognizing that it has an ecological carrying capacity. So there's that as well. So here's a quick overview now of the first subsection or the first section of the Steady State Economy Act pertaining to fiscal policy, the Sustainable Budgets Act, which the full title is a bill to establish sustainable federal budget principles and processes. Obviously, this is not like a 2026 budget. This is about the principles and processes for budgeting that must be adopted to attain sustainable budgets going forward. And it comprises 9 sections, including the short title, and which typically is found in a section 1 of an organic act like this. So section 1 names it the Sustainable Budgets Act. In section 2, as usual, we have the findings and declarations of Congress. And really, for a paradigm shifting bill like this, findings and declarations are really the key to the whole thing. Findings give you the background on what the problem is. The declarations explain clearly that G in the SAT G model goal. All right, and then we got segments on these things that I'm going to go through in the subsequent slides, and I don't want to get too far behind, so I'll just move right into those. First of all, the findings. Congress finds that sustainable and balanced federal budgets reflect and contribute to a sustainable level of economic activity of the nation. It's a subset of national spending. And that sustainable level of national economic activity is a steady state economy. So we're doubling down with these feeder bills what we're doing at large with the omnibus bill. We're bringing out clearly, explicitly, the steady state economy as a goal. Subsection 11 of subsection A is that an optimally sized federal budget is neither too small for social well-being nor too large for ecological capacity. So again, optimal, the concept of optimal. So you see here just a handful of congressional findings, and there's 9 other. And again, here, remember, we have to remember that GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And so, you know, what's good for the public goose is good for the private gander and vice versa. We expect the public to, you know, have responsible, ethical levels of spending. It's got to start. It's got to also be the case in and from the federal government. All right, so Congress had those findings, and then Congress declares that, all right, we got to deal with what the term long-term means. So a period of 150 years is an appropriate long-term planning horizon for environmental and economic sustainability. So federal budgets, they can't just be thinking of next year. They must be cognizant of a long-term horizon. And so then Congress declares it the policy to manage its budget in a manner conducive to the establishment and maintenance of a prosperous but sustainable steady state economy. Once again, now it's become a goal. It's a policy. And then the federal budget has to be conducive to an optimal steady state economy. So it's really reflecting the findings, the paradigm shift of Congress that we hope happens within our lifetimes. All right, and then these findings and declarations give question to some of the terms involved. So here's a few examples from our section 3 on definitions. Sustainable means ecologically and economically operational for the long term. Now, what does long term mean? That's sufficient to include protracted and complex ecological, social, demographic, and economic processes and trends. It implies a period of 150 years. It's like the 7 generations of Native American ethics. Sustainable budget then means federal spending that comports with those earlier principles, plus doesn't exceed 25% of GDP, which in turn fits within the ecological capacity of the nation. And then there's 5 other definitions. Now, section 4 is some very basic constraints of budgeting, like federal outlays shall not exceed expected federal receipts and shall not exceed the receipts from the prior fiscal year. That helps right away to get the government contribution of the steady state economy. Budget shall include sufficient appropriations for programs mandated. That should be a no-brainer, but put it in there to make people understand, we understand that. And then the budget may include appropriations for non-mandatory programs. Section 5 on the no net gain and demand. I think people across the board, including people on the so-called right, would really appreciate this one. The Congress shall not mandate programs, policies, and procedures requiring additional outlays without concurrently identifying antiquated or unnecessary programs, policies, and procedures. Now, the right and the left and they're going to disagree perhaps on which ones are antiquated or unnecessary, but hopefully we can all agree on this part at least. Section 6 now on the mandatory caps, Social Security, Medicare. Here's where we pass the buck a little bit to the poor old CRS. They've got to, within a few years, produce 5 viable options for stabilizing or lessening the aggregate level of Treasury payments for military pensions, veterans benefits, etc. And then the similar leadership in these agencies does likewise. It's explained in the act. I urge you to read the act, which you can readily find by Googling Sustainable Budgets Act. Section 7, sustaining departments. We identify the EPA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Marine Fisheries Service in subsections 9, 13, and 14, and then 30 others, 1 through 8 and 10, etc. key agencies that are all about that second really crucial of CASSE's 15 favorite, maintaining that system of lands that is our foundation of the economy and prosperity and livability and biodiversity and ecological integrity. So we studied it. We've studied all of the federal departments and agencies and identified what we call the sustaining ones. And then we do have the caps on discretionary spending. We put a cap on national defense at 10% with exceptions like war. We've got a few other ones. This one, we made a mistake, and I'll show you why in just a minute. However, this one would be on 0.7% for the Department of Commerce. Could be a temporary, a bridge to what we're going to show you next. And then same thing with education, because in our final section, we're sunsetting departments and agencies, similar to how we identified these sustaining departments and this is a very 21st century steady state approach. What we have in the government is a very 20th century growth oriented approach that needs to be swapped out. So these are agencies among the 57 agencies and programs and departments that we have identified should be phased out. And that's things like the Agricultural Marketing Service, the Commerce Department, Economic Development and International Trade Administration, the Space Command, Office of the U.S. Trader. So please go to the bill, leave your each of these feeder bills has an article that kicks it off, and then toward the end of the article, you will find a link to the feeder bill. So go to the feeder bill, look at what else we have cut out of there and see what you may want to add or what you may totally disagree with. There's a lot of negotiation that will have to happen on the Hill to get the list settled upon. So now we basically have our mission half accomplished. We've got the principles and procedures for a sustainable budget. Now we have to deal with the other half of this equation, the revenue. And for that, we turn it over to our senior economist, Dave Shreve, a top expert on exactly these matters. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it very much. I'll be introducing what we call the Sustainable Taxes Act, which, as Brian noted, is the spending side of the taxing and spending that, in this case, the U.S. government does, but which is an integral part of all world governments. I'll begin by simply outlining the Sustainable Tax Act major components. And I've got two screens to show here, one with the major components and the second with the minor. Essentially, what I'm suggesting here with this tax act is that, first of all, redistribution is front and center as a essential component of both a sound macroeconomic policy, but then also a means to attaining a sustainable, steady state economy. So essential being a key word there. The major components, as you can see, have to do with personal graduated income tax, corporate income tax, two parts to that. One related to what we call the GILTI, which has to do with the way in which many U.S. corporations and corporations around the world try to shelter income abroad. And the GILTI regime, which has been established in the last decade or so, has been our attempt to fix that, at least on the margins. We think that it has worked fairly well, and what we offer in the Tax Act is a little bit of a change or a tweak to that. The estate tax is also a critical part of this, reinvigorating it, so to speak, and then eliminating the payroll tax. Largely because we recognize immediately two things: that the payroll tax supports programs that are of general significance and therefore should be funded as anything else of such general significance by the soundest possible means. And we recognize, secondly, that the existing U.S. payroll tax doesn't quite do that. It's quite regressive. And so we call for its elimination. The minor components, which kind of work alongside these major components, we have a family size tax credit limit, which might be the most marginal or minor component of this entire act. Simply a reminder that we want to do what we can to encourage family planning, family size, population, awareness of population and its effect on output and on the economy. Depletion taxes, energy, timber, minerals, water. We see a continued usefulness for those. We want to reinvigorate them to some extent. And then we recognize that one big part of the way in which inequality has proceeded apace in the US economy, but also in most major economies around the world, is through the financialization of corporations and by proxy, the entire economy. And so we want to throw a little sand in the gears here. This is the way James Tobin, who was the first creator of such a proposal, talked about it: a financial transactions tax to kind of slow down the financialization and the impetus toward increased financialization of our economy. And I'll say a few things later about why that's critical. And then a sustainable trust fund we've introduced as well. We recognize that to some extent, depletion taxes will increase the costs of energy, timber, minerals, water, wherever they are applied. And then that has a kind of a regressive side to it. So we propose that all revenues raised by the depletion taxes, which themselves ought to discourage exploitation, but which also could potentially increase inequality, which we want to avoid. We have a rebate provision with a sustainable trust fund, so that up to a certain relatively modest level of income, you'd be eligible for full rebates from the money raised with the depletion taxes. Now, again, the key here is that we recognize that redistribution is not just something that will make us kinder and gentler and lift up people who fall through the cracks, enable us to finance social programs that help us deal with externalities, both just pure economic externalities, but also environmental ones. But we recognize that it's a critical part of sound macroeconomic policy. And the first principle really should be progressivity. Who pays what? And I wanted to put this up here just to give you a general glimpse at the US tax structure. And this would, I think, surprise many people. The Suits Index is simply a pretty useful and long used measure of progressivity. It was developed by Dan Suits at Michigan State back in the late 1970s. And we have alternate measures, but it remains the best one to give you at least a general look at who pays a certain tax relative to their income. And essentially, if you look at the middle of this slide, you'll see that a theoretical flat tax that is not progressive at all would register 0 on the Suits Index. So if it's a positive number, that means it's slightly or moderately or generously progressive. And vice versa, if it's negative, that means it's regressive, which would mean the opposite. That is, that the poorer you are, the greater liability you would bear relative to income. And so if you stack up personal income tax, corporate income tax, payroll, estate taxes, you could throw excise taxes in there as well. You can recognize immediately that of the major federal taxes, the payroll taxes is the regressive component. Excise taxes are the same, but they have much smaller impact. What is surprising to many is that when you roll them all together, the total federal code is not as progressive as we think. That 0.18 number there is relatively low on the scale. It is progressive, but only mildly so. And then, because we have to take into account fiscal federalism, Brian talked about big P and little p and all the levels of government rolled together. When you look at federal, state, and local all together, and you recognize that the state and local taxes are very regressive across the board, then you come up with a total suits index for all taxes in the US that is close to flat. And what we suggest is that for sound macroeconomic policy, you can't have that. So key questions and concepts here that we're approaching: economic growth, modern mythology. Is inequality a problem? And if it is, what kind of a problem is it? Optimum tax policy. I think I've already hinted at what we're heading toward there. Do we tax income, wealth, or consumption? I'll say a couple things about that. And then living with fallacy and forgetfulness. What does progress look like and how radical must it be? My contention here is that we actually have some traditional tools in our toolbox that have worked very well in the past, and that forgetting that history has come back to haunt us. I would suggest, in other words, that we don't need a big radical change to turn this ship around. Mythology reigns supreme. I refer you to a notable speech given by President Kennedy at a Yale commencement ceremony in 1962. I would urge you to go take a look at it. He decided to weigh in on the pervasive existence and effect of mythology in public policy. It was quite a notable address, and in many ways was the linchpin to turning around his economic policies. The other thing I'd like to point out is back to this issue of having a long tradition on which we can rely so that we don't really need to call for radical change. I want to point out that largely in the mid 20th century, and here are a couple of key New Deal figures from the Roosevelt administration, on up at least through the Johnson administration and the so-called Great Society, there was a long tradition of skepticism toward growth as a means to an end, or an end in itself, or as a principal goal. And here are two of the avatars in the early stages of the Roosevelt administration whose thinking reflect that, I think, very well. Rex Tugwell on the left and Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace on the right, who later became vice president and in 1948 a presidential candidate as well. Here is a glimpse of one of the parts of the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. And I've got a link here. This is a live link. If you click on the Franklin D. Roosevelt and the date below, and you can read this later on. It's a magnificent address. In January 1935, he addressed a joint session of Congress on the way forward and balancing the needs of men and nature, and how at the outset he said that they must work hand in hand, as you see inscribed here on the granite. I would urge all of you to take a close look at that. And then fast forwarding to the Great Society, which I mentioned earlier, here's the famous speech that Johnson delivered at the University of Michigan in 1964. And notice in particular the line that says, "Or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth." And I think you'll see that a skepticism toward growth first and foremost prevailed throughout much of this period from the 1930s through the 1960s. And I'm suggesting that we can recapture part of that tradition quite readily. Now, as far as growth theory and its caveats, and back to the issue of mythology, I think it's worth pointing out a couple of things here. That the so-called avatars of growth theory, and Kuznets was the one who invented, in a sense, the measurements that and came up with the measurements that help us focus on growth, for better or worse. Bob Solow up at MIT was instrumental in developing the essential growth theory that I think most people abide today. And I think it's worth pointing out that both of them were in some ways skeptics of a growth first and foremost approach to economic policy. Kuznets said it pretty clearly at the outset. Welfare cannot be inferred from this measurement, as useful as it might be. With Solow, he said, I think I paid too little attention to the problems of effective demand. And I put a reference to Okun's law up there is because it was Art Okun, who worked with Bob in the Kennedy administration, who pointed out that the important goal here was the gap between actual and potential GDP. And what he saw was that full employment or unemployment told you what that gap was, and that the employment and opportunity inherent with the full employment goal is the real goal here, not GDP, not output. And then I think it's also important to remember that when you're comparing actual and potential GDP, remember what potential GDP means. It has to do with population, labor participation, leisure versus work, all of which can change. And what I would suggest, by and large, is that a progressive tax code is going to be instrumental in bending in a downward way the level of potential GDP, so that when you're focused on closing this gap that was so important to Solow and Okun, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, that you're closing the gap and aiming at a target that is a lower, potentially lower target, not higher. And Heather Bushey, working more recently in the Biden administration, pointed out in a relatively recent statement that, if you simply looked at inequality and focused on it and adjusted your instruments accordingly, I would argue progressive taxation being one of the key instruments, that if you went back to the levels that prevailed in the 1940s, even with lower growth, and that's an important clause, this would have closed 2/3 of the mobility gap. And you could substitute for mobility inequality, poverty, whatever you will. That's what she was referring to. So the general point here is that the goal is really opportunity, employment, and economic activity, not a fixed level of GDP that somehow has to grow in infinite terms. We need to go from thinking add or subtract to thinking add and subtract. And that we can look at this globally as well as nationally. The really simple idea here is that there are some things that we will have to add. That is, if we have prevailing unemployment and we have an Okun gap, then we need to close that gap. But we can just at the same time work on subtracting from that so-called potential GDP target, so that when we're closing that gap, we're aiming at a lower overall level of GDP. The price of inequality, I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about this, one of the things that prevails when you ignore inequality or you allow it to simply grow without end is that you're actually raising the denominator in the employment GDP ratio, so that you need a certain level of opportunity and employment, I would suggest. But if that ratio is expanding, or the denominator is expanding there, the GDP target, then you're really spinning your wheels. Consumption function, fallacies and implications. This was at the heart of John Maynard Keynes' work. great work in the 1930s, the simple idea that as income increases, people have a tendency to save a greater percentage of that income as it rises, which simply means that marginal income, as it rises, has less value as it accrues. This suggests that a progressive tax structure comports very well with bending an economy more toward necessities and away from luxuries. Papering over Ponzi schemes and growth for its own sake versus sustainable prosperity. One way that we've ignored this basic principle is by growing at all costs or focusing on growth for its own sake. And the idea here is that if you don't want to struggle over redistribution politically, and it can be quite a struggle, then you just, as they say, bake a bigger pie, and then perhaps the folks who are left behind won't complain as much because perhaps their pie slices are growing a little bit too. But that's no way to run a sound economy. Now, there is a global catch-22 if you do things right and you turn it around, and I feel like we should mention that briefly anyway, and that is that part of this depends on population and demographics, and there is going to be a little catch here when you fix things macroeconomically, and I would argue that reduction of inequality will lead to a positive demographic response and a fertility transition that will help in many ways. But because of human nature, you're going to have a delayed birth rate response always as mortality drops in various parts of the world, whether it's in a developed nation, in pockets of poverty, or abroad in undeveloped nations. And so the point here is that the transition may take a while. Tax policy, emollient, or fundamental factor, I'll just emphasize again, we regard it as a fundamental factor. In other words, this is not necessarily just how you pay for programs that you like, but how you run macroeconomic policy, and it's a key part of it. I won't read this, but I would urge you all to read it later. If you pull up these slides later, this was an early essay by Keynes in which he talked about in the midst of the Great Depression, how he still had a positive outlook. And it's focused on really two things here. One is the incredible productivity and productive potential of modern economies, so that he saw that we have more than enough to share and that we can readily bend our economies toward necessities, away from luxuries, toward leisure, away from work, and at the same time, adhering to scientific principles and focusing on population, approach of fertility transition so that we can lower population and make it all easier to fix. Now, I have a series of charts here. I just want to show you one thing. And if you look at these charts, you'll notice on the right side of all of them, you'll see a kind of two lines that start to grow apart. And I think what Keynes was talking about in terms of productive potential and how you could reduce inequality with macroeconomic policy, bend your economy more toward necessities and away from luxuries, might be reflected at least somewhat in the left side of this chart from 1948 to 73. And essentially what we've done is that we've grown our economy by larger amounts than necessary, not to keep people prosperous, but to somehow enlarge the economy on the behalf of a few. So you've got productivity proceeding apace, hourly compensation falling behind. Essentially, you'll see where that goes on the next couple of slides. This one, again, I won't dissect it in detail, but what you'll notice here is that it separates sort of who gets what in terms of general output. And you'll see that at the bottom, median compensation has remained relatively flat. So what these next segments represent, going all the way up to the solid blue line are essentially wasted amounts of output that don't go to lift up people, create opportunities, create jobs, et cetera, but they're going to either to an increased share for capital, increased prices, that would be the terms of trade, or inequality of compensation, that would be higher salaries for those at the top and compressed or depressed salaries and wages for those at the bottom. And then here's a real simple way of showing that if you look at both the United States, and I picked Indiana here as a good state example because it's part of what used to be called the Rust Belt, where you've seen basically a shift gone from workers to the gross operating surplus of companies and their shareholders. You can pretty much see that the reduction on the left is pretty close to the increase on the right. Now, part of what will be implied, and this clashes a little bit with some of the things that Brian introduced, but we can maybe take some questions on this after I finish in a few short seconds, is that you do have some pitfalls when you raise more revenue with a progressive code and you actually introduce the idea that perhaps there should be more public goods rather than less. And these are some of the potential pitfalls. I won't read them, but they have to do with the prevailing corporate culture and how it tends to bleed over into government practices. I think we need to keep our eyes on that ball as well. And then at the bottom, as Keynes pointed out, increased leisure must be one of our goals, but it can't happen naturally or organically. I think policymakers will have to focus on that as well. And then when public pricing happens, you've got to have an eye to redistribution and its impact on consumers and folks of different classes. So to finish, I'll point out that congruent with Keynes's approach, that he was looking at an idea of sound macroeconomic policy centered on redistribution, and in particular, progressive income taxes, which he sort of took for granted in his age when he wrote this in 1936, but also looking toward a future of increased leisure and a clear fertility transition. He was a little bit surprised. He died in 1946, and he saw the kind of trend that was emerging after World War II. He was a little bit surprised by that, but he still believed at his death that we would be smart enough to bring ourselves to reduced population and a fertility transition. Here is a chart that shows you, I think, how we can readily attain more leisure than we would normally let on. The U.S. being kind of in the middle of this spread of hours per worker, per person employed. Germany might be a useful target at 1355. Germany is also notable for having the highest productivity of all the nations on this short list. So there's plenty of room for increased leisure and less work. And then last of all, I think I'd like to leave everybody with a positive note. I highlighted this one in yellow, representing the line of 2.3 global replacement fertility. And this is an interesting graph where the countries are represented both by their position relative to fertility, but also by their population. So the side-by-side length of the line associated with India, for example, there in the yellow, is longer than the line associated with other nations because of their greater population. What this gives you a look at is how where we stand now, and this one has us registering 2.5 global average fertility. It's down to about 2.4 now. But if you look at this glimpse, you'll see that roughly half of the world's population was below replacement and half above. Now that left side tail is a little taller than the right side tail is deep, which is a concerning matter, but we are trending in the right direction. I would argue that this is a trend that should be encouraged, not discouraged. And Brian will cap it off by reminding you of a few things regarding our work and how you can find more information. Thank you.
Thanks for packing a lot of punch into tax policy there, Dave. It was great. And yes, we, with the above, feel that we have provided a vision that accomplishes what so much of the right would like to accomplish in terms of fiscal conservatism and fiscal sanity, frankly, and dealing with the scarily unsustainable debt and deficit spending, but in a way that prepares us, that sets us up for a steady state economy as part of the broader Steady State Economy Act. And please keep up with what we're doing. We publish a monthly update on the progress of the Steady State Economy Act in our blog, the Steady State Herald, and that typically includes a new feeder bill. Next one's on population and immigration. I'm just coming from Chicago, where we had a degrowth conference, and boy, it's a real minefield that is to talk about stabilizing population, surprisingly, even in that crowd. So this is something, but we have a very, very unique stance on this, which CACOR has heard about in the past, and we feel it's the best approach, all things considered. And our feeder bills from each of these monthly articles that kick off a feeder bill, there will be a link. It'll be in the last section of the kickoff article. In the last section, you will see a description of what's in the bill, and you'll find a link to the bill. You can go there and read the whole thing. And then for the Omnibus Steady State Economy Act itself, you can follow our progress. This is a linkable link here as well to the draft table of contents. It's fairly finalized, actually, but it's kind of a living, breathing table of contents with and the sections that have a corresponding feeder bill at the table of contents will have a link to those feeder bills as well. So thanks CACOR so much. CACOR members, CACOR audience, you have a great thing going, and we're very pleased to be able to provide the 256th presentation in your great series. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian and David. A very polished and well-structured presentation indeed. Now we have some questions, and I think the first is David Doherty. I'll ask David if you put your question forward.
Sure. Thank you, Nigel. Thanks, Brian and Dave. Very interesting talk. You touched on this a little bit in a couple of places. In particular, you mentioned Keynes, for example. This, in a way, relates to some of his work. The question is as follows. It's two questions, but directly related. To allow for response to surprises, would a steady state government, if you want to call it that, and economy have to operate below certain critical levels, government debt as an example? If not, how would government deal with circumstances similar to those faced by the United States in the 1930s and 40s? In the 30s, it was the Great Depression. In the 40s, it was the great threat from the Nazi Axis.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. And Brian, if it's okay, I'll start and maybe you can add something. I would argue that, and this kind of dovetails with, I think, the emphasis of my presentation, and that is that the surprises should be minimized if you take the appropriate approach to macroeconomic policy. Now, Keynes, I would argue, was not a macroeconomist who believed in an equilibrium. So his theories are clearly a disequilibrium type theory, which means that he believed you'd always have oscillations around an ideal. You would never be able to preserve the ideal for eternity, or even very long past the short term. But the notion is that you keep your economy as close to that as possible. And I would regard his general theory as suggesting that if you have appropriate redistribution and a monetary policy geared to low long-term interest rates, that is, so that your expected profit threshold is low enough so that the demand represented by the people who receive the income that is redistributed by fiscal policy will spur sufficient investment to keep things humming along. He believed that the only problem you'd really have to wrestle with in the future would be, again, how to divide your time between leisure and work, how to share productivity, but also how to stem inflationary impulses that come when you're sharing, as you would in such a macroeconomy, and there's going to be jealous forces that at play that at any time or another don't want to share as completely, and that's where you get inflation. It's a fight over those, essentially over those income shares. But I would argue that the work of Abba Lerner is instructive here too. He coined a phrase called functional finance, and he suggested that if you don't do the general theory approach to macroeconomics well enough, that is, you don't redistribute enough with your tax policy or your spending policy, or your monetary policy gets off track, then you probably have to undergo some deficit financing to square the circle. And that's what he meant by functional finance. So you need flexibility, to be sure. I think that is all still congruent with what Brian talked about. That is the long-term goal for balance and reducing output.
Well,
Yeah,
I appreciate that. Just a second, Brian. It spurs a thought. I want quickly to explain this, and then I'll let you say what you wish, and I'll just go off to the side. It sounds like a rather euphoric world in which you don't have to deal with other countries. You don't have to deal with the chaos of the environment. You don't have to deal with things like an extended famine or drought. I just have a real fear that if you try this approach, you're not going to be, you won't be ready. You won't be able to handle the real tough decisions that are bound to be faced at some point. As for example, right now in Canada, we're facing what many of us feel is an existential threat from people who have been, until very recently, our closest ally.
Right.
Yeah, all right, Dave. So we would, excuse me, we would not be proposing a steady state economy act were it not for the fact that we are students of ecological macroeconomics. And you probably saw early on in my introductory material when I related to the audience some of the basic policy principles that you will find in the great Daly and Farley textbook. One of them being that you need to provide a buffer when you're planning. You need to apply a precautionary principle. And so quite to the contrary, I think this approach that we're describing is not something that would be predisposed to failing to recognize limits to growth, the natural limits. And some of those limits are surprising to the non-ecologist, but they're not all that surprising to the global geologist, the ecosystems ecologist. And so, for example, right now, one of the phenomena that is in the process of lowering economic capacity in the long run is global heating. There will be some areas where it's going to increase capacity, but the best science we have available so far is that in the aggregate globally, it's going to reduce capacity, and especially along coastlines, the very most populated parts of the world, where sea level rise is a very a threat in action as we speak, and it constantly underemphasized, underestimated because of the political pressures to do exactly that, to underemphasize and underestimate, with insurance monies tied into governments at the different levels and so on. So no, we need to apply more and more as the 21st century goes on ecological macroeconomics, so that we don't fall into that trap like the one I mentioned with forestry and their concept of maximum sustainable yield. No, it should be safe, sustainable yield.
Right.
That allows at any given time for a long window, a long run of that level of economic activity.
I would add,
Okay.
Dave, that we've probably waited too long. So you're correct. We've found ourselves in a bit of a trap here. One reason I wanted to use those graphs that I put up there is that you see bent points at a pretty common spot there on all of those graphs. 1970, 1973. Had we adhered to the path we were on and noticed the warnings that were coming from the top and the bottom during the preceding decades, we could have forestalled some of this. So yes, we're getting into the game a little bit late, but better late than never, I would say.
Okay. Peter McKinnon, you have a question. Would you please go ahead? And after that we'll call on Ted Manning to ask his question.
Yes,
Can people show themselves at this point? Because it'd be nice to see our group of our round table here.
There's
It's
Peter
hard to
with his
see
maple leaf.
Yes, we have to worry about bandwidth
it's
tonight.
actually a baseball
sorry.
cap, Toronto. Yeah, I have it because of bright light in front of me. Simple question, and it's not core to your presentation, which I appreciated. But I found that this big, beautiful bill, when it was passed by Congress, shocked me. Why would Congress, and my question is, and I'll just read it, what was the motivation by Congress to pass the big, beautiful bill with such a debt level in public spending? And the second part of my question is, who benefits beyond the banks and investors? Thanks.
I have a theory, Brian. You want to go with yours first?
Yeah, I'll take this one first this time. I think you kind of answered your own question there, Peter. The banks and Wall Street, that's who's going to benefit. And of course, a lot of the individual members of Congress who are very tied in with those. But the other thing is there's the omnipresent pressure for pork, if you want to look at it cynically, for funding in your home district, in your home state. So we've just got to have a Congress and an administration that has developed a real sense of limits to growth and a real and more alarm, frankly, about the unsustainability and insolvency, which puts so much at risk ecologically and but also financially, even, with the dollar as a reserve currency, like the Ray Dalio fellow is always writing about.
It just seems so out of place to be adding so much more debt, which seems to be a bit on purpose.
Well,
Unbelievable.
it was on purpose, and I would argue that uh, as awful as it was, it really wasn't out of place if you put it into the context of
I'll stop my
partisan,
video, sorry, because the connection's weak.
yeah, partisan American politics over the last 50 years. I would introduce to all of you, if you haven't heard it before, the notion of the two Santa Claus theory. This was posited by Jude Wanniski he was the Wall Street Journal editor back in the 1970s, and he wrote a column in another publication where he urged his Republican cohort to give up on the politics of austerity that they had embraced for decades, going back, to the early 20th century. And he said, we keep losing because we're the people who take away the goodies rather than give the goodies. And our opponents on the Democratic side get to be Santa Claus. So what he suggested was, here's what we do. We make tax cuts our gift from Santa to the American people. We keep talking about frugality and cutting the budget and the kinds of things we've talked about for years, but we don't actually act on that anymore. Let's assume that we can deliver the goods and not cut budget and not take away goodies at the same time. And essentially what he was arguing in a crude sort of a way was what I would call the embrace and adoption of a special Keynesian theory. Keynes suggested
Yes.
that his general theory, focused on redistribution and long-term low interest rates, should provide opportunity and full employment for everybody with balanced budgets. But if you didn't do that well enough, then you needed a special theory to be put in place for special circumstances when you were falling short. And that was deficit spending. Unfortunately, I think many policymakers and observers today regard the special theory as the general theory, and it's not. And essentially what I'm arguing here is that probably since Reagan, certainly since George W. Bush, and definitely with President Trump, the modern Republican Party has adopted special theory Keynesianism.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great analogy of the two Santa Clauses. Yes. But it
Thank
seems
you.
irresponsible in this
Well-
case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Our next question is from Ted Manning, and following him, we'll go to Art Hunter. Ted.
Hi, Dave and Brian. That was very good. And you definitely got us to address the basic questions within which we try to operate. I'm a social and environmental scientist and have been for over 50 years. And I'd like to make a couple of observations and then ask you to reply from your perspective. I think, and I think you said it too in some ways, that we have programmed our people in both Canada and the US to be consumers and to view the economy as a zero-sum game where I win as long as somebody else loses and I do better than they do. And when we program people to this extent, it's going to make them very skeptical of anything that asks them to accept less, to reduce their impact, and so forth. In a sense, growth and greed become their prime directive because they've been programmed since birth. And now we have to try and redirect them to deal with the kinds of solutions that you have been proposing. My question, therefore, as a social scientist is, are the people themselves the problem? And how is your approach going to be able to deal with that?
Okay, if I start, Brian?
Absolutely.
Well, Ted, great question. And people are always the problem. And that's why this should be called political economy and not just pure economics, because it's homo economicus is not at play here. These are real people with real emotions and sinners and saints alike. Sometimes, as Walt Whitman said, more than one personality type in the same individual.
How can you tell them apart?
Yeah, but what I would argue, and I think Keynes was optimistic
Yeah.
in this regard too, and go back to that 1930 address, Economic Possibilities for His Grandchildren, a very optimistic gloss on the future in the middle of the Great Depression. He believed that if you did those things to share essentially
Mhm.
income that could be produced in just huge quantities, given the productive potential of modern economies, that people would learn to accept um, a kind of a lighter touch, if you will, on the planet, because more needs would be satisfied, either with public goods or with improved distribution of income in general in the private market as well, where you'd have compressed salaries and wages and whatnot. And I think the Scandinavian countries are a good example of this. I would argue that a lot of their uh, uh, structure that set them up for success in the middle of the last century has been eroded somewhat, but they're still avatars of a place where people can accept more leisure than work, where they have reduced inequality, um, and where their output is lower as a result, because their whole economy therefore is focused more on necessities rather than luxuries. Now, there's always a place for luxuries, and I think it's important to point out that by leisure, increased leisure, that doesn't mean doing nothing. It means, putting more energy toward the arts and literature, for example, and hobbies and uh, living in nature, hiking, recreational opportunities, etc. And so it's that was important uh, uh, to Keynes. He was a benefactor of the arts. He married a ballerina, of course, and so he saw leisure in much the same way, and I think we should too.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ted, I mean, there's the old dictum, people change, cultures change. There were some things that were really embedded that eventually changed: slavery, smoking, there, we feel that as society, it either does or it doesn't wake up to this unraveling ecosystem, the ecosystem unraveling that we're experiencing in so many ways. But I think there's a pretty decent chance it does because of global heating. And you feel it's not quite as logically connective as biodiversity loss, because that's such a cause and effect. There's so much cause and effect clarity there. With global heating, well, you got to deal with the greenhouse effect, and you got to deal with the sources of greenhouse gases, anthropogenic versus natural. So there's challenges, but I feel that there's a decent chance that people will start to, I don't know, some of you guys may have read my first book, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. And the idea there was that as people wake up to limits to growth in the 21st century, they're going to start having a real different attitude toward the gold-plated sweet, like a Trump displays proudly, but to conspicuous consumption in general, the Hummers, the McMansions, the fur coats, all that stuff will become, instead of something sought after or behaviorally something to pursue, it becomes something to frankly kind of despise and turn people off. And once that starts happening, I think there's tremendous potential for a conservation politics in the United States. And we still have a portion of the Steady State Economy Act where we want to get at some of that, like prohibitions on wanton waste. And we do have some luxury tax provisions already in the Steady State Economy Act. I think those ought to be strengthened, frankly, but yeah, it's certainly isn't gonna be easy, right? And at the end of the day, we're on a runaway train. There's gonna be some crashing. It's a matter of how much we can slow it down. And therefore, how many casualties can we save in terms of species and ecosystems and obviously people?
So I regret that Mike Nickerson is not here because he's written some very good books, including More Fun Than Less Stuff. And I think we would love to reply to you on this one.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
we've
the
talked with
other-
Mike, many times. I think
It's
we're
good.
on board,
Yeah.
of the same ilk,
Mhm.
I believe.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
I would suggest too, Ted, that part of this, especially when you're focused on the macro, as we are
Mhm.
here, is
Yeah.
on moving from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. So you don't
Mhm.
expect all behaviors to change, but you
Yeah.
expect the general backdrop of policy to encourage more of the better behavior versus the worst behavior, and it does work. I would suggest that China, as as hard as they are to understand today, moving in many directions at once, over the last 20, 25 years, clearly reduced inequality, created middle class opportunities. And I would regard that the positive fertility transition came about there not because of the one child policy necessarily, but because of that reduction of inequality, which led to opportunities for women, et cetera. So, that's
Well, I'll agree with you on total on that. I was actually there at the time helping them write their sustainable development strategy. And yes, they were starting to lead us.
Yeah, yeah, and to me that's a great example of moving into a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious one. And the sad note is that their current leader appears to want to push back on that. It's a shame.
Regrettably.
Yeah,
True.
yeah.
Thank you both very much. That was interesting.
Thank you. Yes, let's hope. Next, Art Hunter, you have a question, and I think bringing up the subject of more fun and less stuff. And following that, we'll have a question from Fernand Faulkner.
Yeah, I just like to remind you that of a comment which someone on this series made some time ago that said the best environmental dollar there can be is the dollar that isn't spent, because when you spend it, there's greenhouse gases generated, et cetera. And I thought that was always a very interesting comment that fits right in again with the Mike Nickerson one, which more fun, less stuff, which is a very loaded saying, and I really encourage it. And of course, if you've been in communication with him, by all means, you have so much in common that I'm sure that you can get mutual benefits from any of your discussions. However, my real question is regarding your section 9, and I just wrote it down here: sunset agencies and programs, and at least in the world that I've lived my life in, it seems like there's tremendous resistance to change that says we are already at the ideal position. It's like the putting a marble in a bowl and it rolls to the bottom, and no matter what you do, which direction you push it, it always comes back to this ideal condition of right now. So there's great resistance, or at least I see, sunsetting an agency. Oh my, that strikes me as as extremely difficult to do. Starting the agency up is tough. Winding it down is even tougher, and the same with programs. At least in my mind, you did mention it, but I'd be interested in some of your comments on What is the best way to do this? You know, you can cut their budget, but boy, resistance is going to be so high. Go ahead.
Well, that's certainly true. And yet we have had a DOGE. These are getting to be crazy times. I feel a lot of it is because of limits to growth and the bumping up against limits to growth. People are fed up with what they see when they look out the window. It's nothing like what it looked like 30 years ago when they were happier. It's more crowded, it's more noisy, there's all kinds of different stuff going on. The change is too fast. So they're for the chainsaw, it's just they're for the wrong chainsaw. We feel like those people that look out the window and see that the lessening of the greatness. You know, they're trying to make stuff great again. What they've been doing is watching, they've been encouraging those forces of change by having this MAGA movement that empowers a growth-obsessed president and his minions. Running the Department of the Interior and privatizing our public lands and running a DOGE and slashing agencies like USAID, for God's sake, and NSF, etc. So Art, I think right there you're seeing it can happen when there's enough disgust and enough alarm. And frankly, I kind of think a lot of that stuff should happen, but not with those agencies. We need to develop our steady state movement such that when the next big slashing occurs, it's slashing in the right places at these. And I'm not going to feel sorry for a lot of I got forced out of government. You might say, technically I resigned, but I was kind of pushed out for simply trying to raise awareness about the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. So people in the Department of Commerce, they're well connected with Wall Street, they're well connected with privates. I'm not too worried about them finding a landing spot when their government job ends. That's the short answer, but there will be a lot of cases, some real tough ones, like does the United States have, for example, enough capacity to carry on with the Fulbright program, the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Fund? I showed you the 5 or 6 examples that I thought would be very resonant with the CACOR crowd, but there's a lot of other ones that are a lot tougher. One thing we looked at is a redundancy. We don't want to lose something like a Fulbright scholarship program, but when there's a lot of redundancy with some of the other scholarship agencies in the government, well, then maybe we can manage to do without that kind of thing. There are many examples out there of redundancy in federal agencies. I could rattle some off, or else, you know what I'll do? I'm gonna paste the link to the Sustainable Budgets Act itself, not the article, but the actual act. And that should have went to the whole group there. And if you go all the way to the bottom, that's section 9, you can look at that list of 57. A lot of them are very pro-growth outfits that, why have something like a Denali Commission? That one's not even the best example, but the Delta Regional Authority. There's one even up in the New England region to help them their economic growth prospects. That last I looked, that New England region's not doing so bad. They got a lot of counties that are still great, And they have a lot of opportunity up there. They're close to you guys, where you guys got all that great Canadian opportunity. So,
Okay.
yeah, I just feel, I feel like there would be a lot of support for saving significant funding, but we don't want it to happen unless the reasons are right. That's why we put it in this context of the steady state economy.
Well, I would add, Art, that as Brian pointed out numerous times, this is not intended to be a blunt instrument like the DOGE chainsaw. And again, it would require a rationalized approach to budgeting. We haven't had that in a while. But I think two things are worth considering as well. One is that it's conceivable, and I would argue very likely, that if you increased the supply of universal public goods, let's just say passenger rail, for example, that you would likely fundamentally and significantly reduce personal consumption, the C in the CIG. And by virtue of doing that, it would automatically lead to less induced investment, thereby reducing the I in the C plus I plus G. So what you would tend to see is maybe a slight increase in the G with corresponding reductions in the C and the I that exceed the increase in the G. That is, I would expect that to happen. So you always have to keep that in mind as you, it's not a static model. It shouldn't be. It should be dynamic, the way those three work together. The other thing I would say is that if you look at it politically and historically, there is one department in the United States government where we have made substantial cuts periodically, and where, for a number of reasons, mostly tied to not having a good macroeconomic policy, not achieving full employment, that we look at some of these departments, one in particular that I'll mention, as a jobs program. And they shouldn't be jobs programs as much as they should be departments and agencies that do the work of the people. And their merits should be, they should be decided on those merits. The one that stands out historically, where we've made cuts and it's benefited all of us economically, I would say in the early 60s and the mid 1990s, we did this successfully in the United States, and that is the Pentagon, the Defense Department. It's a department where we've successfully made major cuts in those two eras to the benefit of the entire economy. And that's because I think it stands alone, perhaps, as a department where the mission has always been twofold since World War II anyway, and that is national security is part of it, but also providing jobs is another. And I would say that second object should be eliminated or reduced.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Fernand Faulkner, you have a question. Please go ahead. And after that, I think, well, David Doherty, you had another question.
Myself,
Fernand?
yes. Okay, you can see me. Okay.
Yes. Good.
I'm commenting as an engaged citizen. And my question is, that you've developed in an American context, your edifice of steady state. And it's very inspiring. And I'm wondering, we are in a position here in Canada where we're going to be getting the federal budget delivered in September or later. And I would like to hear your how we could use it to assess, use your instrument in our assessment of this budget. That would be a practical use of it for people who are advocating for a prism to look at the budget in terms of the principles of limits to growth, for example. So I would be very interested to hear your comments, your thoughts on how we could use this steady state instrument, and what to focus on, or what points would be important to focus on. We will
Okay,
also.
I'd like to address that one because
Yeah.
that SBA was my baby, and I feel the findings and declarations are the place to start. And if there's going to be real progress made in the US or Canada, anywhere really, their politicians need to understand the basic principles more than they do now of truly sustainable fiscal policy. Other than that, I wish we had a long time to talk about this, and let's try to follow up with, because it's also the matter of finding right representatives in the parliament, or in whatever, at whatever level you're trying to work with. And the concept though of balancing the budget, I mean, that's going to resonate with most people. And then the concept of what's good for the public goose is good for the private gander. Don't you on Wall Street tell us you got to balance that budget. When they're growing gangbusters, including on a lot of debt. So I think if the government sets an example, it needs to do so for the right reasons, and sustainability of the economy at large is a pretty right reason in the 21st century.
Yes, well, I'll use this moment actually, Brian, to add to Fernand's question. There seems to be a rising currently with Canada. There's going to be a tension between, and it's partly a result of the trade war, for us to invest more in big projects, particularly resource extraction projects, pipelines, mines, some renewables too, mass transport. That's probably good. But that's going to stress the balance between sustainable and us surviving economically. Maybe that's just more of a comment on my part. I don't know if you can add anything, if you'd like to add anything to that.
Well, I got to add one thing. I mean, Canada right now, I would hope, would be pushing back against the outfit that wants to make Canada the 51st state. So you can say to your colleagues, your friends, your political parties that here's what comes of the world when you're obsessed with GDP growth, and you're after energy dominance and all of the above. And I don't think the reaction in Canada should be to tap everything possible. It ought to be calm down there, you states down there, and think about the future a little. We're concerned about a lot more than next year's GDP.
Well,
Right.
Yeah.
it also underscores the significance of trade and trade wars. Remember that the principal cause of the Great Depression around the world, not just in North America, but around the world, was rising inequality, where we were going through a productive era and we weren't sharing that productivity very well with workers and citizens. But the camel that broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back, was essentially the autarkic trade wars that developed, after the American tariffs were introduced in 1930 and beyond. And sometimes that's all it takes, is just a little push in that regard. So unfortunately, the tendency when you have erosion that comes from something like that is that you've got to grow your way out of it. Because what you're focusing on is what I called the oaken gap before, the gap between actual and potential output. Well, I argued via the presentation today that there are better ways to close the oaken gap than digging up more minerals in your territory. But that is a tendency, unfortunately, and I think you're going to have to fight it there in Canada as this unfolds. But the other thing to point out, back to Fernand's question, is that the reason I tried to make a distinction between the general and the special theory is that the general theory and its precepts apply everywhere all the time. That's what is meant by general. So they would apply equally well in Canada as the United States, Europe, developed world, you name it. And that's why I think it's so tragic that essentially what we've embraced is the special theory variant instead. And it's opened the gates to things like the two Santa Claus approach of the American GOP.
Yes, and
Thank you.
we will be looking to put your theory to test
Yeah.
in other
Thank you.
in other environment, in other context. Because
Yeah.
they're coming up with national nation building projects, and so we need to have an angle for which to look through at those and assess them.
Mhm. Precisely. Yes. Well put. Well put. David Doherty, I think you had a question dealing with drug abuse and suicide and work.
Okay, sorry,
Mhm.
I hit the wrong button.
Oh,
I have to share the end slide in a minute, but I had actually sent you something because Art said we needed to end the program. We can skip my
yes.
question and go to it after the recording has stopped.
And
Okay. So we need to wind things up now. And I thank you all for the discussion and questions. And over to the final comments on and thank yous. Do we have a?
Could we have, Ted, could you come and thank the speaker, please?
Sure, happy to. I'll hang around long enough to say nice things to people. One point, I'll make one final comment. Just remember that Santa Claus is Canadian.
That's right.
And based on that, we are waiting for our presents. But that said, the whole idea is to get people to duck their obsession with consumption, growth, and greed, and not sharing. And if we are able to do anything about that, we may all win. So I would like to thank you for your excellent suggestions and ideas. And I think this will continue for a while until we get there. So thank you again for talking to us, getting us interested in talking about how to fix things. I would ask anyone who is not now a member, please join us. We now have a new fee structure so that people who just want to be associate members and don't want to get involved in organizing things, they can get away with it. And that is now available. And we would also ask people to share these presentations. They're all available online, and it will be on within a few hours once Art gets it all, or David, whoever's doing it today, is getting it organized. So thank you again. And we would also ask you to subscribe when you get on. That again gives us credibility, and other people watch it. And many times, hundreds, if not thousands of people actually watch this once it goes live. It goes available on YouTube. So thank you very much. And we would now ask you to put on your video.